There's an old joke. Scientists have determined that the world is going to be destroyed by catastrophic flooding, which will engulf the whole world in 2 weeks. Not 1 inch of land will remain. The earth will be totally underwater, and there is nothing that can be done to prevent the catastrophe. So all the great religions convene their greatest leaders and call on them to prepare their followers for the end of the world. Some of them urge repentance and speak of an afterlife. Others speak of acceptance and peace. But the rabbis gather the Jewish people and say to them, "We have 2 weeks to learn how to live underwater." As with the best jokes, there's a profound truth embedded in this one. For thousands of years, our people have taken this approach to catastrophe. We've learned how to live underwater. When the world is turned upside down, whether through exile, persecution, or pandemic, we adapt. Just look at what we're doing tonight. We create. But the foundation of adapting and rebuilding, or of learning how to live underwater, is a willingness to confront the reality we face, to name it, acknowledge it, and to allow ourselves to mourn what has been lost. One of the greatest treasures of Jewish ritual and tradition is the approach to loss and grief. Woven throughout our rituals is an insistence on confronting the stark reality, not with resignation, nor with stoicism, with tears, with sorrow which no words can soothe, with silence and with simple presence with those who mourn. The Jewish burial is one in which mourners and those who accompany them participate in shoveling earth onto the casket. The sound of that earth and the shovel and the weeping which accompanies it are not sounds to be quieted, to be shushed, but rather we bear witness to it. We participate in the mitzvah of comforting mourners simply by being present with them, which is the purpose of Shiva, the first 7 days of the mourning period. We are present to the pain. In Western culture more generally, there's a great deal of denial around death, or platitudes such as, "They're in a better place. They lived a good life." In Jewish tradition, a death is acknowledged as absolutely ungraspable and unbearable. And yet, we bear it by being present to it. It is a kind of mindfulness. Our tradition teaches us that with loss, there is no getting over. There is moving through. There is learning to live underwater. And in learning to live in this new landscape, we find that we build something new out of the loss. The loss becomes a part of us. It travels with us, and we grow around it. It is woven into the fabric of our identity. What can the Jewish perspective on grief and loss teach us about how to live and endure, to survive and even to thrive in this moment in which we have lost so much? Some losses as enormous as the loss of a loved one, and some losses seemingly smaller. The simple ability to gather with family for happy occasions, to go to the theater or to a baseball game. And of course, to gather here in our sanctuary. Some of the losses of this time are chronic, ongoing, unlike a death. We need to learn to mourn and let ourselves be opened and shaped by these losses while they are still taking place, while things are still being taken from us and will yet be. We mourn while we fear yet more loss, as institutions we once assumed could withstand any challenge are now vulnerable and precarious. Even our very democracy, our postal service, our electoral process, the most dependable things seem so fragile now. In addition to the rituals around death and mourning, which demand that we confront the reality of death, the very cycle of the year can teach us about loss and mourning and rebuilding as well. What is the sacred day that kicks off the season of turning, return, and repentance? What is the starting line for the journey into the new year? Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning for the ancient temples, along with all other catastrophes to befall our people. The mourning experience for the temples is something we cycle back to every year, just as we observe a yahrzeit for a loved one. The time of vocalizing our lament on Tisha B'Av, we read the book of Lamentations called Eicha. Eicha means how? How can this be? There's such a starkness in the text and the liturgy, that sense of disbelief and that outcry. And that is what lays the groundwork for us to heal and create better relationships with ourselves, with one another, and with God. Rabbi Alan Lu, Zichrono Livracha, points out that Yom Kippur is the, quote, culmination of the process that begins on Tisha B'Av, when we acknowledge the darkness, when we let our guard down, when we turn toward the truth. Decline and destruction necessarily precede renewal. Tearing down is necessary before rebuilding is possible. And all these things, fullness, decline, destruction, renewal, tearing down, and rebuilding, are actually part of the same process. Points on a single continuum, consecutive segments of a never-ending cycle. The time between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, this great 7-week time of turning, is the time between the destruction of Jerusalem, the crumbling of the walls of the great temple, and our own moral and spiritual reconstruction, end quote. Acknowledging the depth of our loss is the very foundation from which we build something new. Whether it is creating our new life after the death of a loved one, which weaves the death of our loved one into it, or creating new ways of worship after the destruction of the temple. The 5 stages of grief, as proposed by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Sometimes, as we know, all of these come at once, and they come in waves over time, not in a straight line. And sometimes we get stuck in the denial phase, which actually impedes our healing. In Tractate Ta'anit of the Babylonian Talmud, which is itself a creative expression and adaptation created out of destruction and exile, we read, "All who mourn the destruction of Jerusalem will merit to see it in its joy." All who mourn the destruction will merit to see Jerusalem in its joy. So the ancient rabbis, who were sticklers for detail, wondered, why doesn't it just say all who mourn the destruction will see it rebuilt? Why specifically that they will merit to see it in its joy? Rav Kook, the late 19th, early 20th century first chief rabbi of Jerusalem, explained that the sages knew that when the time comes for Jerusalem to be rebuilt, everyone alive at that time will witness the city's reconstruction. Even those who did not grieve Jerusalem's destruction will see it being rebuilt. But only those who were pained by Jerusalem's destruction will merit to see the city in joy. Only those who are grieved by its state of ruin will experience the great joy as Jerusalem is restored to its former glory. Only when we give ourselves the time and space to confront the reality, the pain of what has been lost, can we experience fully the rebuilding of something new. Because the rebuilding and the adaptation always includes within it the experience of pain. There is the expression, the only way out is through. To bring it back to the original anecdote about learning to live underwater, only when we've grieved for the deluge that destroyed the world as we knew it can we learn to live underwater. In another part of the Talmud, Tractate Brachot, we encounter a beautiful and powerful story of coming face to face with loss, being present for it and for others as they encounter it. The story goes that once Rabbi Elazar fell ill, and Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him. Rabbi Elazar was poor and lay in a dark room with no windows. Rabbi Yochanan bared his arm, and light radiated from him, filling the room with light as he entered to be with Rabbi Elazar. Thereupon he noticed that Rabbi Elazar was weeping. He asked, "Why do you weep?" Rabbi Elazar replied, "I am weeping because of your beauty, which will one day rot in the earth." Rabbi Yochanan replied, "On that account, you surely have reason to weep." And they both wept. Rabbi Yochanan was known to be physically incredibly beautiful. In this story and in our experience of life, we learn that no one, not the most beautiful, the most wealthy, the most powerful, can escape the inevitability of death. What we can do is acknowledge it and be present with each other in that awareness. And when we do that, we bring light to the darkness. Weeping is not valued in our society. Stoicism is. When we bear the weight of so much loss, so much grief, we might be afraid that to begin to let the tears flow might just open the floodgates, and we will be overwhelmed and unable to move forward. However, our tradition calls out to us through millennia of destruction and adaptation and creation that it is precisely by letting go, releasing into tears, letting them flow, that we will be able to move forward. In fact, our tradition teaches us that there is growth and transformation that is only possible when we learn to face the world in its pain and grief unguarded. Another Talmudic source tells us, actually it's Rabbi Elazar again, he says that since the day the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked, and prayer is not accepted as it once was. Yet, despite the fact that the gates of prayer were locked when the temple was destroyed, the gates of tears were not locked, and one who cries before God may rest assured that his prayers will be answered. Each year, Yom Kippur asks us to enter the gate of tears. We tap our hearts when we say the communal confessional, not to punish ourselves, but to open ourselves to acknowledgement of what hurts we have caused and of what we have lost. Rabbi Toba Spitzer has written, we tap our chest gently during each recitation of wrongdoing, as if we are saying, broken, 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 open, open, open. This year, this most sacred day, which asks us to acknowledge brokenness and vulnerability, comes at a time of communal grief, and a communal grief that is ongoing due to a pandemic that is out of control in our nation and coupled with anxiety as we face an unprecedented election with the incumbent asserting authoritarian intentions. I want to ask us, as painful as it is, to name and acknowledge the losses we have experienced and the losses that we fear. I pray that connected to this sacred community, together even in virtual space, that you feel held and embraced by community, tradition, and God, enough to let your tears flow. This is such a part of what our community is here for. Friends, we have been through a trauma. Our lives were upended. Our children, our teachers left school one day not having any idea they wouldn't be back for the remainder of the school year and beyond. And that's just one example. It is okay to feel the grief, the anger, the loss. You aren't alone. You are part of a community, a tradition which knows how to hold such grief. And I am with you, and we, your community, are with you. We had a moment of experiencing grief together when on Erev Rosh Hashanah we learned that the Honorable Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died. Thank God many of us were together in our Rosh Hashanah Seders, or perhaps we were gathered with other friends and family, even if virtually. I witnessed audible and visible mourning at the shock and devastation of this news for many people. This past week was filled with public mourning as this trailblazing leader became the first woman and the first Jew in American history to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol. And for the first time in history, our Jewish mourning rituals and liturgy rang out from within the stately halls of the Supreme Court, as my friend Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt of Congregation Adas Israel in Washington, D.C., chanted El Malei Rachamim and Psalm 23. And from within the Capitol itself, Rabbi Holtzblatt chanted, Min hametzar karati ya anani v'merchav ya. From the narrow place, I cried out to God, and I was answered from the wide expanse. From Psalm 118. Right there, in the inner sanctum of our nation's seat of government, the Jewish way of mourning was fully present. The mourning, the mournful chanting of these ancient words rang out and were, in their own way, in that moment, teachers for a nation deeply in need of healing. Healing doesn't mean getting over. It means growing around. And we need the time of mourning in order to continue to grow. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of putting broken pottery pieces back together with gold, built on the idea that in embracing flaws and imperfections, you can create an even stronger, more beautiful piece of art. I heard a story about two strangers who both traveled to the steps of the Harvard Law Library to honor Ruth Bader Ginsburg with candles. Can I put my candle next to yours? One of them said to the other. Let us put our memorial candles next to one another and remember that to pause, to absorb the enormity of the world's pain, our nation's pain, our own losses, large and small, concrete and ambiguous, is not only permitted, but necessary. We have and we will learn to breathe underwater. First, we must allow the tears to flow. On Rosh Hashanah, we say that the world is born anew. Out of the enormity of our grief, that over 204,000 of our fellow citizens have died in the past 6 months, while our federal government turns the other way and sows destruction, devastation, discord, and distrust, rather than working to protect us. Out of the enormity of that grief, that outrage, that anger, we will rebuild. We will allow ourselves to mourn so that we can heal. The losses we and our nation have suffered will become a part of us in the same way that all losses and tragedies do, for individuals, communities, and nations. First, we need to let the hurt in. Let us use the intensity of our grief as a key to the transformation this season calls us to begin. We have entered into a new year. We are building a new world. Let us use the open gates of Yom Kippur to open our hearts to the pain of this time. When we let ourselves break open to it all, we can adapt, build, heal, and grow toward something new. It is the numbness we must break through. Let the breathtaking losses of this time do exactly that. Take your breath away, because only by doing that can we learn to breathe underwater. Something new is being born at this moment in history. It is up to us, when we find our way of breathing underwater, to ensure that this new world is safe, just, compassionate, and equitable, a world in which we can all breathe. Gemar Chatima Tova, may we be sealed for life in the book of life in this new year.